You know, there are stories from history that get buried so deep, you'd think someone's trying to hide them on purpose. And maybe they were. Because what I'm about to tell you involves a respected doctor, wartime secrets, and experiments that crossed every line imaginable. This isn't some Hollywood fiction. This happened in Canada during the Second World War, and the man at the center of it walked free for decades while his victims suffered in silence. His name was Dr. William Thornton. At least, that's what we'll call him for now, because the real identity of this physician was protected by layers of government secrecy for years after the war ended. He worked at a facility in Ontario, a place that officially didn't exist on any public records. The prisoners who passed through its doors were labeled as dangerous enemy combatants, men who'd fought for the Axis powers and now found themselves far from home, locked behind barbed wire in the Canadian wilderness. What they didn't know was that some of them would become subjects in medical trials that violated every ethical principle established since the days of Hippocrates. The year was 1943. The war was raging across Europe and the Pacific, and Canada had become home to thousands of prisoners of war. Most were German, some Italian, a handful Japanese. These men were housed in camps scattered across the country, from the prairies to the forests of Ontario and Quebec. The camps were meant to be holding facilities, places where captured soldiers would wait out the war in relative safety according to the Geneva Convention. 3 meals a day, basic medical care, protection from the elements. That was the deal. That was what international law demanded. But at one particular facility, something else was happening. This camp was different from the others. It was smaller, more isolated, surrounded by dense forests that made escape virtually impossible. The prisoners sent there weren't chosen at random. They were selected. Some had medical conditions that made them interesting to researchers. Others were simply unlucky, plucked from the general population of POWs and transferred without explanation. Once they arrived, they noticed things weren't quite right. The medical building was larger than it needed to be, much larger. It had examination rooms that looked more like operating theaters, with equipment that seemed excessive for treating common ailments. The doctor in charge, our Dr. Thornton, was cordial enough at first. He spoke some German, enough to communicate basic instructions. He'd greet new arrivals with a smile, assure them they'd be well cared for. Some of the prisoners even felt relieved to be there, instead of in the larger camps where tensions ran high and boredom was suffocating. But relief turned to confusion, then to fear, as the true nature of the facility revealed itself. It started with medical examinations that went beyond standard checkups. Prisoners were asked to provide blood samples, far more than seemed necessary. They were weighed, measured, their physical capabilities tested and recorded in meticulous detail. Then came the diet experiments. Groups of prisoners found their rations changed without warning. Some received meals lacking in certain vitamins. Others got food deliberately designed to cause deficiencies. The doctor wanted to see how the human body responded to malnutrition, how long it took for symptoms to appear, whether some individuals were more resilient than others. One prisoner, a young German soldier named Klaus, later described how he and 15 others were put on a diet almost entirely devoid of vitamin C within weeks. Their gums began to bleed. Their teeth loosened. Old wounds that had healed years ago started to break open again as their bodies literally fell apart from scurvy. Klaus remembered begging for fresh vegetables, for fruit, for anything that might stop the pain. The doctor took notes, measured the progression of their symptoms, and told them this was necessary for medical science. They were contributing to knowledge that might save lives, he said. Just endure a bit longer. The scurvy experiment went on for 3 months. By the end, 2 of the prisoners couldn't walk. Their legs had swollen to twice their normal size, covered in bruises that spread like dark continents across their skin. Only when one man's condition became life-threatening did the doctor finally introduce vitamin-rich foods back into their diet. He documented their recovery with the same clinical detachment he'd shown during their deterioration. But the nutritional studies were just the beginning. Dr. Thornton had bigger ambitions. He'd read about high-altitude experiments being conducted in Germany, tests designed to help Luftwaffe pilots survive at extreme elevations. He wanted to conduct similar research, but Canada didn't have the pressurized chambers the Germans used. So he improvised. He had a large tank constructed, something like a diving bell, where air pressure could be reduced to simulate high altitude. Prisoners were placed inside, sometimes for hours, while the doctor monitored their vital signs through a small window. The men inside experienced nosebleeds, severe headaches, difficulty breathing. Some lost consciousness. One prisoner, a 32-year-old Italian officer, suffered what appeared to be a stroke during one of these sessions. He survived, but the left side of his body remained partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. When other prisoners asked what happened to him, they were told he'd had a fall. The truth stayed locked in Dr. Thornton's files. What drove this man to cross such boundaries? That's the question that haunts anyone who studies this case. By all accounts, William Thornton was a talented physician before the war. He'd graduated near the top of his medical school class, done his residency at a prestigious hospital in Toronto, published papers on infectious diseases that earned him recognition in academic circles. Colleagues described him as brilliant, dedicated, perhaps a bit cold in his demeanor, but nothing that suggested he was capable of what came later. The war changed him, or maybe it just revealed what was always there. When the government began looking for doctors to staff the POW camps, Thornton volunteered immediately. He saw an opportunity that civilian practice could never provide, access to human subjects without the ethical constraints that normally governed medical research. The prisoners were enemy combatants, after all. If experiments on them could yield knowledge that helped Canadian soldiers, wasn't that justifiable? That's how he rationalized it, according to documents that surfaced decades later. The camp commander, a military officer with no medical background, gave Thornton essentially free rein. As long as no prisoners died under suspicious circumstances, as long as the experiments remained secret, the doctor could pursue whatever research he deemed important. It was a recipe for disaster, but in the fog of war, normal safeguards broke down. People looked the other way. Paperwork got filed in drawers and forgotten. The prisoners themselves had no way to report what was happening to them. Letters home were censored. Red Cross inspections were scheduled well in advance, giving staff time to hide evidence and coach prisoners on what to say. As 1943 turned to 1944, the experiments escalated. Thornton became interested in infectious diseases, particularly how they spread in confined populations. He deliberately introduced bacterial cultures into the prisoners' food supply, carefully measured doses that would cause illness but theoretically not death. He wanted to track infection rates, see how disease moved through the camp, test whether isolation protocols could contain outbreaks. What he created was a living laboratory where human beings became petri dishes. Men fell sick with violent stomach infections. Dysentery spread through the barracks. The camp infirmary filled with prisoners suffering from fevers, dehydration, delirium. And through it all, Dr. Thornton took his notes, collected his data, refined his theories. When prisoners asked for proper treatment, he provided just enough care to keep them alive but not enough to halt the experiments. He was testing the limits of human endurance, seeing how much suffering a person could withstand before their body gave up entirely. There was a young prisoner named Johann, barely 20 years old, who'd been captured in Italy after his unit surrendered to Canadian forces. He was a farm boy from Bavaria, conscripted into the Wehrmacht, terrified through most of his brief military service. When he arrived at Thornton's camp, he was healthy, strong from years of physical labor. The doctor selected him for a cold exposure study. Canadian winters are brutal, and Thornton wanted to understand hypothermia better, how to treat soldiers who might be trapped in freezing conditions. Johann was taken outside on a January night when temperatures dropped to -25 Celsius. He was dressed in light clothing, no coat, no gloves, no hat. The doctor and two assistants monitored him as he stood in the cold, timing how long it took for symptoms to develop. After 40 minutes, Johann was shivering so violently he could barely stand. His fingers had gone white, then blue. His speech became slurred. They brought him inside and placed him in a tub of lukewarm water, documenting every stage of his recovery. Then, 2 days later, they did it again. And again. 5 times over the course of 2 weeks. Johann developed severe frostbite on his fingers and toes. 3 of his fingers on his right hand had to be amputated. He was 20 years old, and he'd spend the rest of his life unable to make a proper fist, unable to do the farm work he'd grown up doing. All for research that duplicated studies already conducted elsewhere, studies whose results were already known to medical science. The war ended in May 1945. Hitler was dead, Germany surrendered, and gradually the POW camps across Canada began to empty out. Prisoners were repatriated, sent back to a devastated Europe to rebuild their shattered lives. The men who'd passed through Thornton's facility went home too, most of them keeping silent about what they'd endured. Who would believe them? Who would care about the suffering of enemy soldiers when the world was still counting the millions dead from Nazi atrocities? The moral calculus of the post-war era had no room for nuance, no sympathy for Wehrmacht prisoners who claimed they'd been mistreated by the Allies. Dr. Thornton returned to civilian practice. He joined the staff of a hospital in Ontario, resumed his career as if nothing had happened. His wartime research, all those meticulous notes and files, were packed into boxes and shipped to a government archive where they were classified as secret. The official reason was national security, protecting methods and information that might be useful in future conflicts. The real reason was embarrassment. What Thornton had done violated the Geneva Convention, violated every ethical standard of medical practice, violated basic human decency. If it became public, there would be an international scandal. Better to bury it, seal the records, and hope no one ever asked difficult questions. For 20 years, that strategy worked. Thornton aged into a respected senior physician, trained younger doctors, published papers on mundane topics like pneumonia treatment and hospital hygiene. He never spoke about the war years, and apparently no one pressed him for details. The prisoners who'd been his subjects were scattered across Europe, dealing with their own trauma, their own struggles to rebuild. Most assumed what happened to them had been sanctioned by their captor's government, just another cruelty in a war full of cruelties. They didn't know that even by the standards of wartime, what Thornton did was beyond the pale. Then in 1967, something changed. A German journalist named Dieter Klein was researching a book about POW experiences in Allied camps. He'd interviewed dozens of former prisoners, collected their stories, compared notes. Several men mentioned a facility in Canada that seemed different from other camps, a place where medical experiments were conducted. Klein was skeptical at first. The stories sounded almost fantastical, too extreme to be true. But multiple sources told similar tales, described the same doctor, remembered the same building layout. Klein realized he might have stumbled onto something real. He spent 2 years tracking down more witnesses, gathering what documentation still existed. Former prisoners who'd kept silent for decades finally found someone willing to listen. They told Klein about the scurvy experiments, the pressure chamber, the cold exposure trials, the deliberately introduced infections. They showed him scars, told him about permanent injuries, described nightmares that had haunted them for over 20 years. Klein compiled it all into a thick dossier and then faced a problem. How could he verify any of this? The Canadian government wasn't going to hand over classified files to a foreign journalist. So Klein did something clever. He published a preliminary article in a major German newspaper, laying out what he'd discovered and calling for an official investigation. The article caused a minor diplomatic incident. The West German government, trying to maintain good relations with Canada, formally requested information about wartime POW treatment. The Canadian government, now under pressure, couldn't simply deny everything. They admitted that medical research had been conducted on prisoners, but characterized it as benign, necessary for the war effort, properly supervised. They released a heavily redacted summary that acknowledged experiments but downplayed their severity. Klein wasn't satisfied. He kept digging, and in 1969 he found the breakthrough he needed. One of Dr. Thornton's former assistants, a nurse who'd worked at the camp, agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. She was elderly by then, suffering from cancer, and apparently decided she needed to unburden herself before she died. She confirmed everything the prisoners had claimed and added details that made the situation even worse. She described experiments Klein hadn't heard about yet, tests involving drug reactions, surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia to study pain tolerance. She'd witnessed all of it, participated in some of it, and the guilt had eaten away at her for decades. Her testimony gave Klein enough corroboration to publish his full findings. His book, released in 1970, created the international scandal the Canadian government had feared. Newspapers across Europe picked up the story. Human rights organizations demanded accountability. The few surviving victims were located and interviewed, their testimonies broadcast on television. And at the center of it all was Dr. William Thornton, now 73 years old, retired, living quietly in a suburb of Toronto. Reporters descended on his home. Thornton, confronted with the allegations, didn't deny them outright. Instead, he defended his actions. Everything he'd done, he insisted, was scientifically valid and necessary for the war effort. The prisoners were enemy combatants who'd killed Allied soldiers. Using them for research that might save Canadian lives was morally justified. He showed no remorse, no recognition that he'd violated fundamental ethical principles. To him, the ends had justified the means. The legal system struggled with what to do. Technically, Thornton had violated the Geneva Convention, but prosecuting him presented enormous challenges. The crimes had occurred 25 years earlier. Many potential witnesses were dead. The government had been complicit by allowing the experiments to proceed and then covering them up. Bringing Thornton to trial would expose institutional failures at the highest levels. Politicians weighed their options and made a calculation. They condemned the experiments publicly, expressed regret, offered compensation to surviving victims, but stopped short of criminal prosecution. Thornton died in 1974 at the age of 77. Having faced public disgrace but no jail time. The government inquiry into his activities continued for several more years, eventually producing a report that confirmed the worst of Klein's allegations. The experiments had been extensive, harmful, and conducted without proper ethical oversight. Recommendations were made to ensure nothing similar could happen in future conflicts. The report was filed away, and gradually the story faded from public attention. But for the men who'd been Thornton's subjects, there was no fading. Klaus, the scurvy experiment victim, never fully recovered his health. He died at 56 from complications related to his wartime malnutrition. Johann, who'd lost his fingers to frostbite, struggled to hold jobs, eventually ended up on disability support. The Italian officer who'd suffered the stroke lived into his 80s but remained partially paralyzed, a daily reminder of what had been done to him. None of them received adequate compensation. The payments the Canadian government offered were nominal, bureaucratic acknowledgments that carried no real weight. What makes this story particularly chilling isn't just what one doctor did, but how easily it happened. Thornton wasn't some rogue monster operating completely outside the system. He had authorization, resources, official support. People knew what was happening and chose not to intervene. The camp commander filed reports that must have mentioned the medical research, even if they sanitized the details. Military officials approved budgets that funded the experiments. Government bureaucrats classified the documents after the war, making a conscious decision to hide the truth. This wasn't one bad actor, it was systemic failure. And we have to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. How many other cases like this existed and were successfully buried? How many experiments were conducted that left no paper trail, no survivors willing to speak up, no journalists persistent enough to uncover the truth? The historical record is full of holes, gaps where inconvenient facts were erased or hidden. For every Thornton whose crimes eventually came to light, how many others retired peacefully, their secrets intact? The Nuremberg trials after World War II established that following orders is not a defense for war crimes, that individuals have a moral responsibility to refuse unethical commands. Yet here was a case where a doctor committed acts that would have fit comfortably into the indictments at Nuremberg, and he faced no comparable justice. The difference was he wore the uniform of the victors, worked for an allied nation, could cloak his actions in the rhetoric of wartime necessity. History, they say, is written by the winners. Sometimes that means uncomfortable truths get rewritten or deleted entirely. The prisoners who survived Thornton's experiments went home to a Germany that had committed unspeakable atrocities, crimes on a scale that dwarfed anything done to them. In the moral hierarchy of post-war Europe, their suffering barely registered. They were former Wehrmacht soldiers, tainted by association with the Nazi regime regardless of their individual actions. Sympathy was in short supply, so they kept quiet, carried their scars, and tried to build what lives they could in the ruins. Decades later, when the truth finally emerged, it forced a reckoning with uncomfortable realities. Good countries, democratic countries, countries that prided themselves on civilized values could still commit profound wrongs when circumstances provided cover. The machinery of war creates opportunities for cruelty, and human nature being what it is, some people will seize those opportunities. Ethics become flexible. Oversight breaks down. Atrocities happen not because of grand evil plans, but through accumulated small decisions, each one rationalized, each one approved by someone who should have known better. Dr. William Thornton probably believed he was doing important work. That's the truly disturbing part. He wasn't cackling in some dungeon, delighting in others' pain. He was a physician who'd convinced himself that the suffering he caused served a greater good. He took his meticulous notes because he thought he was contributing to medical knowledge. He defended his actions until the end because in his mind, he'd done nothing wrong. That capacity for self-deception, for moral blindness wrapped in scientific language, that's what makes his story a cautionary tale rather than just a historical curiosity. The experiments at that Ontario camp produced no meaningful scientific advances. The nutritional studies repeated research already done. The altitude experiments added nothing to existing knowledge. The infectious disease work was ethically compromised to the point of being scientifically worthless. All that suffering, all those permanent injuries, all those ruined lives, and there was nothing to show for it except files in an archive that nobody wanted to read. Thornton's legacy wasn't medical progress. It was trauma, injustice, and a dark chapter in Canadian history that took decades to acknowledge. Today, we have institutional review boards, ethics committees, international protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. Human experimentation is heavily regulated, requires informed consent, demands that potential benefits clearly outweigh risks. These safeguards exist because of cases like Thornton's, because history taught us what happens when doctors are given unchecked power over vulnerable populations. The rules are written in the suffering of those who came before, reminders that good intentions and scientific curiosity are never sufficient justification for causing harm. But rules only work when they're enforced, when people have the courage to speak up, when institutions prioritize ethics over convenience. The systems we've built are only as strong as our commitment to maintaining them. In times of crisis, in situations where normal oversight breaks down, we see how quickly standards can erode. That's the lesson here. Not that one Canadian doctor was uniquely evil, but that any of us, given the wrong circumstances and insufficient accountability, might convince ourselves that terrible things are acceptable. The story of Dr. Thornton and his experiments on prisoners of war isn't comfortable history. It doesn't fit the narratives we prefer about the Second World War, where moral lines were clear and the good guys were unambiguously good. Real history is messier, more complicated, full of shades of gray that make us squirm. But it's precisely those uncomfortable stories that we most need to remember, to study, to learn from. Because forgetting them, burying them, pretending they didn't happen, that's how we ensure they'll happen again. Those prisoners, Klaus and Johann and the Italian officer and all the others whose names we don't know, they deserved better. They deserved to be treated with basic human dignity even as captured enemy soldiers. They deserved medical care that healed rather than harmed. They deserved justice when their suffering finally came to light. They didn't get any of that. What they got was cruelty disguised as science, indifference disguised as necessity, and decades of silence disguised as national security. Their story stands as testimony to what can go wrong when we forget that every human being, regardless of circumstance, regardless of which side of a conflict they're on, possesses inherent worth that must be respected. The files are still there in the archives, thousands of pages documenting what was done. Some remain classified even now, though it's been 80 years since the events they describe. Maybe that's fitting. Some truths are so ugly that even acknowledging them fully feels like too much. But those files represent lives, real people who suffered, and as long as they remain hidden, the story isn't complete. The victims never got their full day in court, never heard their tormentor truly held accountable, never saw justice done in any meaningful sense. All they got was belated acknowledgement that yes, something terrible happened, and we're sorry, and here's a check that doesn't begin to compensate for what was taken from you. That's the reality of historical injustice. Most of the time there are no satisfying endings, no moments where everything gets made right. There's just the slow, incomplete process of truth-telling, of dragging hidden facts into the light, of forcing societies to confront aspects of their past they'd rather forget. It's messy and frustrating, and it never fully repairs the damage. But it matters. It matters that we know what happened. It matters that we say out loud that it was wrong. It matters that we commit ourselves to doing better, even knowing that commitment will be tested, and that future generations will judge our failures as harshly as we judge those who came before.